For thousands of years, humans stood on the ground and looked up at the sky. We watched the birds with absolute wonder. We saw them glide above the trees, free and graceful. Naturally, we wanted to go up there too. We wanted to touch the clouds. We wanted to feel the wind on our faces. We wanted to fly. But for a very long time, everyone believed this was completely impossible. The smartest scientists in the world said it could never be done. They said humans were too heavy. They said we simply did not have the right bodies to fly. For centuries, flying was just a beautiful, impossible dream. It was a fairy tale. Anyone who actually tried to build a flying machine was laughed at. People thought they were crazy. If you told someone you were going to fly, they would tell you to stop wasting your time. But today, we know that the experts were wrong, and they were proved wrong by two completely ordinary people. These two people were brothers. Their names were Wilbur and Orville Wright. Wilbur and Orville did not come from a rich family. They did not have special connections to powerful people. They did not even go to a fancy university. In fact, they did not have college degrees at all. They lived a very quiet, simple life in Ohio. The Wright brothers loved to work with their hands. They loved machines and tools. So, they opened a small shop to fix and build bicycles. Bicycles were very popular at the time. The brothers were happy, working quietly every single day. Nobody knew their names. They were just two mechanics in a small town. Before we continue this amazing story, I want to stop and say hello. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Write the name of your country in the comments below. I love seeing where you are from. And if you enjoy learning English through real, amazing stories like this, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let us get back to the story. The spark of their incredible dream started when they were just little boys. One evening, their father came home from work. He had a surprise for them. He opened his hands and tossed a small, curious object into the air. It was a little toy made of paper, bamboo, and a rubber band. To the boys' absolute shock, the little toy did not fall to the floor. Instead, it spun around and flew across the room. It was a toy helicopter. Wilbur and Orville were fascinated. They played with that fragile little toy until it finally broke. But they did not cry. They simply decided to build a new one. That tiny paper toy planted a seed in their minds. It showed them that a machine made by human hands could actually conquer the air. It was a simple child's game, but it completely captured their imagination. The idea of flight never, ever left them. They carried that magical feeling in their hearts as they grew older. Years later, as grown men, they were busy working in their bicycle shop, but their minds were always up in the clouds. During the day, they fixed tires and oiled bicycle chains. At night, they sat by the fire and read every book they could find about birds and flying machines. They were obsessed. Here is a perfect example of how they lived. They would spend hours just watching the birds outside their window. They watched how birds tilted their wings to turn in the air. They noticed every little movement. They took their deep understanding of bicycles and they started to apply it to the concept of flight. But here is what matters. Their story tells us something beautiful about life. Big, world-changing dreams almost always start in small, ordinary rooms. You do not need a fancy laboratory to change the world. You just need curiosity, a willingness to work hard, and a dream that refuses to disappear. Wilbur and Orville finally made a big decision. Reading books was not enough anymore. Dreaming was not enough. They decided to actually build a real flying machine. But to test a flying machine, they needed a very specific environment. They needed a place with strong, steady winds and soft ground for crashing. They wrote letters to the weather experts and the government. They asked for the windiest places in America. Finally, they found the perfect location. It was a harsh, isolated beach in North Carolina called Kitty Hawk. It was hundreds of miles away from their comfortable home. It was a wild, lonely place made of sand and ocean. Traveling to Kitty Hawk was not easy. They had to take trains and small boats just to get there. They brought heavy tools, wood, and strong fabric. When they arrived, the environment was completely unforgiving. The sun was hot, the mosquitoes were terrible, and the wind blew constantly. But they were ready to work. They built their first machine right there on the beach. It was called a glider. A glider is like an airplane, but it does not have an engine. It relies purely on the wind to lift it up. The machine they built was huge. It had two large wings covered in white cloth, and it looked like a giant bird. Building the glider took weeks of exhausting physical labor. Their hands were covered in cuts and bruises from pulling the heavy fabric and tying the tight wires. It was heavy, awkward, and difficult to move across the soft sand. Every day was a battle against the elements. But they never stopped believing in their design. Finally, the glider was finished. It was time for the first test. They did not try to ride it immediately. First, they wanted to test it by flying it empty, just like a giant kite. They held the ropes tightly and waited for the wind to catch the massive wings. Their hearts beat fast with excitement. The wind caught the glider, and it lifted off the ground. But the excitement did not last. The machine was wildly out of control. It jerked left and right. Suddenly, it dived straight down and crashed violently into the sand. The wood snapped. The fabric tore. Hours of hard work were destroyed in seconds. Did they quit? No. They picked up the broken pieces, took them back to their camp, and started fixing them. They worked late into the night. The next day, they tried again. And again, the glider crashed. They fixed it again. It was a painful cycle of hoping, failing, and rebuilding. The physical pain was intense. The cold wind bit into their skin. The hard sand felt like concrete when they crashed. They were far from home, tired, and constantly covered in dirt. Sometimes, the flying machine would spin out of control and drag them violently across the beach. It was far more difficult than they ever imagined. After months of failure, they packed up their broken camp and boarded a train back to Ohio. This was their darkest moment. They were completely exhausted. Their money was running out. Every theory they had tried had failed them. The sky seemed impossible to conquer. The dream felt entirely dead. Sitting on that depressing train ride home, Wilbur looked out the window. He was a deeply resilient man, but the failures had broken his spirit. He turned to his brother and spoke a very famous, very sad sentence. He said, "Man will not fly for 1,000 years." Think about how heavy those words were. Man will not fly for 1,000 years. This was the man who would eventually invent the airplane, completely giving up hope. He truly believed that human flight was centuries away. He believed they had wasted their time, their money, and their energy on a foolish fantasy. This is a crucial lesson for everyone listening. Even the greatest inventors in history want to give up sometimes. Feeling hopeless is a completely normal part of any difficult journey. It does not mean you are weak. It just means the problem is hard. What truly matters is what you do after you feel like giving up. Back in their bicycle shop in Ohio, the brothers tried to return to their normal lives. But the puzzle of flight kept calling them. They started to think deeply about why their machine had crashed so terribly. And then, they realized something absolutely shocking. It changed everything they understood. They realized that the old math books were wrong. The scientific tables written by the famous experts were completely incorrect. The brothers had trusted the smartest minds in the world, and those minds had given them bad numbers. The shape of the wings the experts recommended simply did not create enough lift in the air. This was a massive turning point. Wilbur and Orville stopped trusting the famous experts. They stopped relying on books written by other people. They realized that if they wanted to fly, they had to discover the real laws of aerodynamics entirely on their own. They had to become the scientists they needed. But they were still just two bicycle mechanics. How could they solve a complex physics problem that had stopped the greatest engineers in the world? They decided to do what they did best. They decided to build a tool. They stopped trying to build giant flying machines on the beach, and they focused on something small. Right there in the back room of their bicycle shop, they built a wooden box. It was a very simple design. They attached a fan to one end to blow a steady stream of air through the box. They called this invention a wind tunnel. It was a brilliant, elegant solution to a massive problem. Here is how they used it. They created dozens of tiny metal wings. Each wing had a slightly different curve and shape. They placed these little wings inside the wooden box. Then, they turned on the fan and watched how the wind moved over the metal. It was a simple experiment, but it was revolutionary. Through this wind tunnel, they could actually see the invisible forces of the air. They measured the lift. They measured the resistance. They wrote down hundreds of numbers in their notebooks. For the first time in human history, someone was actually gathering accurate, correct data about how a wing behaves in the wind. This shows us a profound truth about solving big problems. Sometimes, you have to take a big step back in order to move forward. The brothers had to stop trying to fly the giant glider and instead focus on a tiny piece of metal in a wooden box. They broke the big problem down into tiny, manageable pieces. After months of testing in their wind tunnel, they finally understood the math of the sky. But they also discovered the true secret to human flight. The secret was not just about building strong wings. The secret was something much more profound. The true secret to flying was control. Before the Wright brothers, other inventors just tried to build machines that would float, like a boat on the water. They wanted a machine that would fly itself. But Wilbur and Orville knew that the air is chaotic. It is full of invisible waves and sudden storms. You cannot just float. You have to actively balance. Because they build bicycles, they understood balance perfectly. When you ride a bicycle, you do not just sit still. You constantly lean your body. You make tiny adjustments to keep from falling over. The brothers realized an airplane must be flown exactly the same way. The pilot must actively control the machine at all times. They designed a new system called wing warping. It allowed the pilot to twist the wings of the glider in the middle of the air. If the wind pushed the left wing up, the pilot could twist it back down. This gave the human being total command over the machine. It was a completely revolutionary idea. With their new math and their new control system, they built a brand new glider. They packed their bags and traveled all the way back to the harsh, windy beach at Kitty Hawk. They were nervous, but they were deeply confident in their new design. They carried the new glider up the large sand dunes. They stepped into the wind and launched the glider. This time, the machine did not dive into the ground. It caught the air and held perfectly steady. Wilbur shifted his body, twisted the wings, and the glider turned smoothly in the sky. It was working. They had finally solved the ancient puzzle of balance. They made hundreds of perfect glides that summer. The joy they felt was indescribable. They were dancing in the air, riding the wind exactly like the birds they had watched from their window. They had conquered the math, and they had conquered the control. Now, there was only one massive challenge left to face. Gliding was wonderful, but it was not true flight. A glider always slowly falls back to the earth. To truly conquer the sky, a machine needs to take off from flat ground and stay in the air completely on its own. For that, they needed power. They needed a motor. They needed an engine. They searched everywhere for an engine to buy. But the engines used in early cars were made of heavy iron. If they put a heavy car engine on their delicate wooden wings, the machine would simply smash into the ground. No company in the world made an engine light enough and powerful enough for an airplane. Once again, the experts could not help them. So, the brothers decided they would simply have to build the engine themselves. They asked their shop assistant, a brilliant mechanic named Charlie Taylor, to help them. Together, in the dusty bicycle shop, they started to design an engine from scratch. To save weight, Charlie cast the engine block out of aluminum. This was incredibly rare at the time. The engine they built was very simple. It had no fuel pump and no fancy parts. It was loud, it shook violently, and it was rough. But it was incredibly light, and it produced enough horsepower to do the job. They also had to design the propellers. Everyone thought a propeller was just like a ship's wheel moving through water, but the brothers realized a propeller is actually just a wing spinning in a circle. They carved the giant wooden blades by hand, using the exact same math they discovered in their little wind tunnel. They attached the new engine and the hand-carved propellers to their biggest machine yet. They called it the Flyer. It was a beautiful, terrifying beast of wood, wire, and heavy white cloth. They packed the pieces into crates and made the long, difficult journey back to Kitty Hawk one final time. It was now November of 1903. The weather at Kitty Hawk was absolutely terrible. Winter was arriving fast. The wind was howling, bringing freezing rain and biting cold temperatures. They had to wear heavy coats and gloves just to survive outside. Their fingers were numb as they tried to assemble the flyer on the beach. Time was rapidly running out. If the winter storms arrived in full force, they would have to pack up and go home in failure. The pressure was immense. They worked furiously every single day, fighting the freezing sand and the constant, bitter wind. They knew they were incredibly close to making history. Finally, the machine was ready to test. They laid down a wooden track on the sand so the flyer could roll forward and gain speed. They flipped a coin to see who would be the first person to try. Wilbur won the coin toss. He climbed into the machine, feeling the heavy weight of the moment. They started the engine. It roared to life, spitting fire and thick, black smoke. The noise was incredibly loud on the quiet beach. Wilbur released the rope, and the flyer shot forward down the wooden track. The machine lifted up into the air. But something was terribly wrong. Wilbur pulled the control lever too hard. The nose of the airplane pointed too high into the air. The machine stalled, lost its lift, and fell violently back down to the earth. It crashed hard into the cold sand. There was a loud crunching sound as the front wooden pieces snapped completely in half. Wilbur climbed out of the wreckage. He was safe, but the machine was broken. The heartbreak was devastating. They were so close, but the freezing winter was closing in around them. Every passing day made the conditions worse. The danger was not just failure anymore. The danger of dying in a terrible crash was incredibly real. They did not have time to order new parts from Ohio. They had to fix the broken machine right there in the freezing camp. They worked with frozen fingers, cutting new wood and tying new wires. The wind shook their little wooden shed constantly. It was a miserable, desperate race against the clock. They spent 3 exhausting days repairing the damage from Wilbur's crash. By December 16th, the machine was whole again. But the weather was getting worse. The puddles of water outside their camp had turned to solid ice. The wind was dangerously strong. They knew they only had one last chance before winter forced them out. The tension in the air was incredible. They were tired, cold, and hungry. But underneath the exhaustion, there was a burning fire of determination. They had calculated the math. They had tested the wings. They had built the engine. They knew their design was perfect. Now, they just had to prove it to the world. The morning of December 17th, 1903 arrived. It was freezing cold. The wind was blowing at 27 miles per hour. It was dangerously windy. But the brothers looked at each other and nodded. It was time. Today, it was Orville's turn to take the pilot's place. Orville slowly walked over to the flying machine. He climbed onto the bottom wing. He did not sit in a chair. To reduce wind resistance, he lay completely flat on his stomach, right next to the roaring engine. He placed his hands firmly on the wooden controls. His heart was pounding loudly in his chest. Wilbur stood near the front of the machine. He looked at his brother. No words were needed. They had shared this dream since they were little boys playing with a paper toy. Now, the dream was a massive, dangerous machine of wood and canvas. Orville released the wire holding the machine back. The engine screamed loudly. The propellers spun into a furious blur. The heavy machine slowly started to move forward along the wooden track. It fought against the fierce, freezing wind. Wilbur ran alongside the airplane, holding the tip of the wing to keep it perfectly balanced. The machine moved faster and faster down the track. Wilbur ran as fast as he could, his boots kicking up sand. And then he let go. The machine reached the end of the wooden rail. Orville gently moved the control lever. The nose of the airplane lifted slightly. And then the impossible happened. The wheels left the wooden track. The machine did not fall. It did not slide. It lifted into the freezing air. It was flying. A machine carrying a human being, powered by an engine, was truly flying through the sky under its own control. For thousands of years, humans had dreamed of this exact second. For centuries, the greatest minds said it could never happen. But there it was. 2 bicycle mechanics from Ohio had unlocked the sky. The heavy wooden machine pushed forward, cutting bravely through the invisible ocean of the air. The flight was not long. The machine suddenly bounced in the harsh wind, and Orville brought it down safely onto the sand. The engine stopped. Silence returned to the cold, lonely beach. The brothers ran to measure the distance in the sand. They wanted to know exactly what they had achieved. The first flight of an airplane lasted exactly 12 seconds. It traveled a total distance of only 120 feet, which is about 36 meters. It was shorter than the wingspan of a modern passenger jet. But those 12 fragile seconds completely changed the history of the world. They flew 3 more times that day, taking turns in the bitter cold. On the final flight, Wilbur flew for nearly a minute, covering over 800 feet. The age of aviation had officially begun. The fairy tale was real. The sky no longer belonged only to the birds. It belonged to all of us. When they walked into town and sent a telegram to their father, they were thrilled. But when the news reached the newspapers, something strange happened. Almost nobody believed them. The journalists thought it was a fake story. The experts still claimed it was impossible. The world simply ignored their incredible achievement. But Wilbur and Orville did not care what the newspapers said. They did not fly for fame or for money. They flew because they had a burning desire to solve the puzzle. They knew the truth. They packed up their machine, went back to Ohio, and simply kept working quietly in a nearby field. They spent the next 2 years secretly practicing in that field. They crashed into bushes. They made mistakes. They looked foolish to the local farmers who watched them. But with every single crash, they learned something new. With every mistake, their machine became better, safer, and faster. They mastered the sky through endless repetition. So, what is the great lesson of the Wright brothers? Why does this story matter to you? The brothers succeeded precisely because they were totally willing to fail. They were not afraid of crashing in the sand. They were not afraid of looking silly. They knew that failure was just information disguised as pain. They did not let the cold wind stop them. They did not let the complicated math defeat them. When the books were wrong, they wrote their own. When the engine was too heavy, they built a lighter one. They solved every huge problem by breaking it down into tiny, simple steps inside their bicycle shop. And this brings us to your journey. You are listening to this story right now because you want to master the English language. Learning a new language is a lot like trying to fly. At first, it feels completely impossible. The words feel heavy. The grammar feels chaotic. You feel like you have no control. When you start speaking English, you are going to crash. You will use the wrong word. You will make mistakes with your verbs. People might not understand you. You will feel frustrated, just like Wilbur on the train ride home. You might even want to say, I will never learn this in 1,000 years. But please remember the lesson of Kitty Hawk. Every single mistake you make in English is just a moment of learning. Every time you try to speak and fail, your linguistic wings are getting stronger. You have to be willing to look foolish if you want to eventually glide smoothly through conversations. So, build your own wind tunnel. Practice a little bit every single day. Read small stories. Listen to clear voices. Do not worry about being perfect. Just focus on making progress. Step by step, word by word, the chaotic winds of the language will start to make sense. You will find your balance. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to this incredible piece of history. I hope it inspired you to keep chasing your own goals, no matter how difficult they seem. Keep practicing your English, keep believing in yourself, and I will see you next time with another amazing story. Goodbye.